It begins with a photograph, a thin glass plate cracked across its corner, the emulsion yellowed by time. The image shows a small boy lying in a coffin. His hands are folded neatly over his chest. His face is serene, almost peaceful, but his eyes, they are not fully closed. The year was 1884. The town was Westbridge, a quiet settlement on the outskirts of Maryland, where superstition and faith often blended into one. The record states that a child named Thomas Llewellyn, age 7, died after a sudden fever that swept through the town in spring. The burial took place on April 12th. Bells tolled and the townsfolk mourned. The coffin was lowered, prayers whispered, and dirt covered what they believed was the final chapter of a short life. But 11 days later, the same family ordered another coffin, another funeral. The record keeper hesitated. The name was the same, Thomas Llewellyn, the cause of death identical. The date, April 23rd. For decades, the story lingered like a rumor, too strange to confront and too tragic to forget, until 1972, when a county archivist cataloging 19th century death photographs found a plate marked Thomas L., second burial. The image was unsettling, not for what it showed but for what it seemed to do. When scanned under modern light, the boy's eyelids reflected a faint glimmer, as if mid-blink. Experts dismissed it as a trick of exposure, an optical artifact caused by early glass plate photography. But locals remembered the whispers that during the second burial, the undertaker refused to touch the body again. Some say the boy was never truly gone. Others believe the photograph captured the cruel border between life and death, a moment when the body forgets it has already crossed over. The question remains, was it merely an error of 19th century science, or proof that some lives refuse to end quietly? Westbridge, Massachusetts, in the winter of 1884, was a town balanced uneasily between progress and fear. The new railroad had brought factories, smoke, and strangers, but not yet comfort. Illness still moved faster than medicine, and superstition clung to the edges of every belief. The townspeople whispered prayers over doorframes and left candles burning at night, hoping to keep death from lingering too long inside their homes. Among them lived the Boyle family, modest, working class, and known for their quiet faith. Patrick Boyle labored at the ironworks, while his wife, Margaret, tended to their 3 children in a small timber cottage at the edge of Mill Street. But that winter, their youngest, Thomas, fell ill with what doctors called lung fever. Within a week, the child's breath had faded. He was 8 years old. Death in those days was not hidden. It was faced, documented, and in its own way preserved. Families often sought the services of photographers who specialized in what was called the mourning portrait, a final image meant to hold memory still. Among the few in Westbridge who offered such work was Elias Kern, a reserved man in his 30s who operated a small studio behind the post office. His reputation was built on precision and patience. He waited for the perfect stillness before opening the shutter. When the Boyles asked him to photograph their son, he agreed, as he had done for others before. On that January evening, the parlor was dimly lit by candles, their soft light reflecting faintly on the boy's pale face. The photograph captured a delicate balance, the serenity of a child in repose, yet with eyes that appeared neither fully open nor closed. 10 days later, Kern was summoned again, but not to photograph. The Boyles had requested a second burial. The reason, they told the pastor, was that the coffin had been disturbed during the thaw, and that the boy's face was not as before. Their words unsettled those who heard them. The Westbridge Herald printed a single line about it in their January 21st issue. An unprecedented reinterment was carried out this week at the Boyle plot, cause withheld by request. No one questioned the family's grief. Only one man remained silent, Elias Kern, who from that day forward never took another photograph. By the spring of 1885, the whispers in Westbridge had grown too loud for the parish to ignore. The story of the Boyle boy, the child buried twice, had begun to take on a life of its own. Some claimed to have seen light in the graveyard at night. Others spoke of the boy's eyes, said to have changed after burial. The local priest, Father Callahan, wary of growing superstition, ordered an informal inquiry. He called it an effort to settle rumor with reason, but few in town believed it would be simple. The parish's investigation began with the documents. Thomas Boyle's death certificate, signed on January 11, 1884, recorded the cause of death as lung fever, but when the coroner's ledger was examined, the entry appeared amended, a second line written faintly beneath the first in darker ink, reading respiration uncertain. No one could say when or why it had been altered. The coroner himself, a man named Whitfield, had died the following year, taking any explanation with him. More troubling was what surfaced from the studio of Elias Kern. Among his neatly kept account books was a single line that contradicted the accepted record. Boyle. Teku sitting 1 Jan 10, sitting 2 Jan 21, 2 dates. 2 sittings. The first corresponded with the day before Thomas's death, was officially recorded. The second, 10 days after his burial. The gravedigger, Samuel Horn, also provided a statement that would keep the case alive for decades. He claimed the soil had been unusually soft for midwinter, as if recently turned. More unsettling, he described no odor, no sign of decay. It was as though the earth had taken him gently, he told the parish. His account was dismissed at the time as the ramblings of an uneducated man. Yet his memory would later prove difficult to discredit. Attention soon turned to the photograph itself, one of only 2 known images from the sittings. The boy's face appeared serene, his right eye half shaded by candlelight. But when examined closely, the left pupil seemed faintly constricted, as though reacting to brightness. Medical experts, decades later, would argue that such contraction is impossible after death. Still, skeptics insisted it might be an optical illusion, a quirk of the collodion process, where even the faintest tremor of light could alter perception. And yet, one thing could not be explained. Post-mortem photography could produce softness, even the illusion of movement, if a long exposure met a flickering flame. But no known process could create the appearance of a blink, not in 1884, and not with the equipment Elias Kern used. By the turn of the century, most who had known the Boyles were gone. Their house stood empty, and Kern's studio had long been shuttered. In 1903, an archivist catalogued the photograph among other Civil War-era relics, mislabeling it simply as child. 1880s. Then it disappeared. Nearly 70 years later, in 1972, the glass plate resurfaced during a university inventory of county archives, wrapped in cloth, cracked but intact. The archivist who handled it reported something peculiar. When viewed under certain light, the eyes seemed to resist focus. Every mystery begins as a mistake, until the evidence refuses to stay. Buried. The rediscovery of the Boyle photograph in 1972 marked the beginning of a new phase in its strange, uneasy history. It had been misfiled in the Massachusetts Historical Society archives for decades, tucked among a collection of Civil War battlefield images. The plate, still wrapped in its original cloth and labeled in fading ink, was brittle and dusted with silver residue. When archivist Daniel Reeves listed it for restoration, he thought little of the name on the accompanying card. Thomas Boyle, Westbridge, 1884. He had no idea that the photograph had once been considered too disturbing to display. Dr. Helen Stroud, a respected photographic conservator from Boston University, was brought in to examine it. Stroud had made a career out of restoring 19th-century glass negatives, but this one unsettled her almost immediately. The exposure notes etched faintly into the plate's margin didn't match the lighting ratios present in the image. The exposure length, she wrote in her notes, is inconsistent with the density of shadow. Either the process was interrupted, or the light changed mid-capture. Both explanations were, by technical standards of the 1880s, nearly impossible. As she worked, Stroud also observed a strange optical imbalance. The left side of the image bore heavier emulsion buildup, as though part of the scene had been re-exposed. In normal portraiture, such inconsistencies might signal damage or error, but under controlled microscopy, the variance appeared deliberate, as if the camera's position had shifted slightly between 2 exposures. In other words, there may have been movement in a scene that should have been still. The photograph, by that point, had already become a subject of hushed fascination among historians of death and mourning. In the late Victorian period, when mortality was constant and medicine uncertain, the bereaved often turned to photography to preserve the illusion of life. Children were posed upright, their eyes painted open on the prints, their small bodies arranged among siblings. For many families, it was the only image ever taken. But grief could distort perception. Historians later described a phenomenon called grief hallucination, in which parents claimed to see motion, a breath, a twitch, in post-mortem portraits. Photography intended to comfort sometimes fed delusion. And yet the Boyle case defied even that psychological framework. If two photographs truly existed, as Kern's studio log suggested, the differences between them could not be explained by emotion alone. When side-by-side prints were examined under spectral light in 1973, Dr. Stroud's team noted subtle differences in shadow placement on the boy's face and collar, variations that could not occur without a change in lighting or angle. "It's as though the child leaned fractionally forward," her report read, between exposures taken at separate moments. A year later, an internal museum memorandum, later leaked to a local paper, mentioned a finding that only deepened the riddle. Dated February 14, 1974, it stated, "Upon magnification, subject's right eyelid shows differential shadow displacement, consistent with downward motion during exposure." It was the first time an institutional record acknowledged what many privately suspected, that the photograph may have captured a living movement. Researchers began to re-examine Elias Kern's career. After the Boyle incident, his later work revealed an unsettling preoccupation with the dead, blurred images, soft edges, and faint spectral distortions that critics described as ghostly. By 1889, he was accused by peers of fraud, accused of staging spiritual photographs to sell to grieving families. Then in 1890 he vanished. His studio was found empty, the chemicals evaporated, the ledger half burned in the stove. Only one letter survived, written by his former assistant and published in a Boston newspaper years later. He said the child was not still, that the boy's eyes would not close, that when the glass cleared he saw what should not be seen. It was dismissed at the time as melodrama, the embellishment of a disillusioned employee. Yet when historians compared the statement to Kern's surviving photographs, they noted a recurring theme, an almost pathological obsession with stillness, as though the photographer had spent his final years trying to recreate or erase a moment he couldn't forget. By the late 20th century, psychological experts entered the debate. Some attributed the illusion of movement to pareidolia, the brain's tendency to interpret random visual patterns as meaningful forms. Others argued that the Boyle's trauma may have led to collective misremembering, a merging of grief and myth. But Dr. Stroud's findings made those explanations uneasy. Every frame, every chemical trace she studied, resisted dismissal. In her final published paper on the subject, she wrote words that have since become the cornerstone of the Boyle mystery. In most cases, the photograph is merely a record of a moment once lived. In the Boyle case, the line between photograph and witness collapses. From that point onward, the story of Thomas Boyle was no longer folklore. It became a question, one that science could not comfortably answer, and that time refused to let fade. By the 1980s, the Boyle photograph had become a strange footnote in Massachusetts folklore, a curiosity whispered in archival circles, but dismissed by academics as an illusion born from grief and poor preservation. That changed when a young medical historian, Dr. Alan Merrick, arrived at Westbridge College in 1982. Merrick specialized in 19th century mortuary practices, specifically premature burial, a fear that had haunted Victorians more than ghosts ever could. He had read about the Boyle case in an old journal footnote and sensed something overlooked, not superstition, but science. Merrick's early notes show a careful skepticism. Claims of resurrection, he wrote, are invariably metaphors for loss misinterpreted through bad documentation. But the Boyle records didn't fit that pattern. The first clue came from the coroner's book of 1884, stored in the county basement, damp, warped but intact. There, beneath the name Thomas Boyle, the listed cause of death read lung fever. Yet on the facing page, Merrick noticed something odd. A faint line had been drawn through the same entry and rewritten in a different hand, darker ink. Uneven pressure, as confirmed fatal. To Merrick, this alteration wasn't clerical. It was defensive. Someone had tried to seal a mistake. He began comparing the Boyle burial records with other deaths in that winter's register. None showed such corrections. Then, deeper in the archive, he found a small packet of letters, tied with cotton string and marked church correspondence. January 1884. Inside were 3 letters from Margaret Boyle, Thomas's mother, written to the parish priest. Her handwriting wavered but was urgent. One line repeated across all 3. I begged them to wait. He was warm still. Forensic historians often talk about moments when a case ceases to be academic. Merrick later said that reading those letters was the moment the room fell silent. He began to wonder if the first burial hadn't been a burial at all, but a living interment, misdiagnosed as death during the height of the winter fever epidemic. At that time, medical understanding of comas was primitive. Shallow breathing and faint pulse were often mistaken for lifelessness. To test his hypothesis, Merrick sought out the 1884 exhumation record, long presumed lost. After months of correspondence, he located it in a state archive under mislabeled civil entries. The report, handwritten and brittle, described the scene in unembellished detail. Upon reopening the coffin, subject exhibited eyes partially open. Fingernails of both hands show scraping impressions against inner lid. The word stunned him. Forensic indicators, especially signs of scratching, aligned with known cases of premature burial in the era before embalming. By all logic, the boy had awakened underground. But the shock deepened with what came next. The final paragraph of the same report noted that the family requested immediate reposition and reburial following visitation by the photographer. Merrick realized this must have been Elias Kern, the same man who had taken the original death portrait. Yet when he examined the surviving image, the one held in the Massachusetts Historical Society, there were no marks, no signs of decay, no trace of the panic described in the exhumation document. Thomas looked peaceful, untouched, almost ethereal. If the report was accurate, then one of 2 things had to be true. Either the photograph had been staged after the boy's second and final death, or the photograph was an attempt to erase the evidence of what had really happened. Kern himself offered no testimony. He disappeared from public record in 1890, his name surfacing only once more in a Boston ledger, noting fraudulent image practices. But even that note left ambiguity. Fraud, yes, but of what kind? Faked death? Altered plates? To push further, Merrick requested the photograph's physical analysis. By the 1980s, new forensic light techniques allowed the study of emulsion layers, effectively fingerprints in the film itself. Under magnification, the Boyle photograph revealed something unprecedented: 2 distinct layers of exposure with differing micro-crack patterns. One showed the initial capture. The other indicated a second image, faintly offset, as if taken days later and printed on top of the first. This was not double exposure for artistic effect, it was technical tampering. Someone had merged 2 moments into one. Merrick's conclusion was cautious but devastating. He wrote, "All material evidence supports a live burial and subsequent re-exposure of the body. The photographic record was likely altered to restore dignity or to conceal error." The press, when the paper surfaced in 1986, seized the sensational aspect. "The Boy Who Blinked," ran one headline. "Victorian photographer covers up premature burial," another. But Merrick himself never embraced the drama. In a recorded interview, his voice softened. "The image doesn't prove a miracle or horror. It proves a mother couldn't let go, and a man tried to give her closure the only way he knew." Years later, in 2023, a digital restoration project by the Massachusetts Institute of Technology revisited the photograph with AI-enhanced pattern recognition. The algorithms confirmed Merrick's suspicion. The fine web of surface cracks didn't align with a single moment of exposure. The timestamps embedded in the plate coating, a primitive manufacturer's mark, showed 2 distinct production dates, 11 days apart. The Boyle photograph, long dismissed as folklore, was now scientifically proven to have been taken twice. But if the boy's body was exhumed and photographed again, who gave that order? The mother's letters hinted at pleading but not decision. The exhumation record named no authority. It was as if, in the wake of a family's grief, the town itself had conspired to tidy away its own mistake. By the end of Merrick's life, the historian had come to view the Boyle mystery less as proof of negligence, and more as an emblem of 19th-century denial. The way people blurred the line between faith, love, and evidence. "We photograph the dead," he said in one of his final lectures, "not to remember them as they were, but as we wish they had remained." And in that sense, the Boyle image accomplished exactly that. It didn't preserve truth. It preserved peace, and however false. "The image may not prove survival," Merrick once wrote, "only that someone could not accept he was gone." The words would later be engraved on his note's final page, a quiet epitaph for both the child and the mystery that refused to die with him. By the late 1990s, the Boyle photograph had settled into uneasy obscurity, a strange relic locked away behind museum protocol and public unease. Most scholars considered the mystery solved, a tragic case of premature burial, later veiled by sentiment and poor documentation. But in 1999, technology reopened the wound. The Massachusetts Historical Society initiated a digital restoration program intending to preserve 19th-century glass negatives through high-resolution scanning. The Boyle plate, long stored under restricted access, was among them. For years it had gathered quiet dust, its image seen only by researchers and archivists who no longer believed its legend. That changed when the Restoration Lab's monitors flickered. At first, the anomaly seemed trivial, a brief tonal shift in the child's face during the scanning process. Yet, technicians noticed that the flicker was localized, repeating only over the right eye of the boy in the coffin. Frame by frame, pixel by pixel, a faint alteration appeared. The eyelid seemed to lower by a fraction, then return. The movement lasted less than half a second. To most, it was a compression glitch, a scanning imbalance caused by the reflective varnish of the 140-year-old plate. But to others, it echoed too closely the photograph's original rumor, the blink. The restoration team replayed the footage dozens of times. Under magnified review, even the most skeptical admitted that the change was not random. The light had remained constant across the frame. Only the tonal density of the eye altered. Whether it was physics or something more elusive, no one could say. The project lead, Lydia Crane, was a precise, methodical technician, the kind who logged every keystroke, every calibration shift. She had no patience for superstition. Yet a week into her work, she filed an abrupt resignation letter. Her official note cited visual distress from prolonged exposure, but an internal email later leaked told a different story. There was a reflection in the pupil. "It moved when I did not." When questioned by her supervisor, Crane refused to elaborate. She left the facility that day and never returned to photographic restoration again. The incident fueled renewed attention. The press, always hungry for resurrection of the old myth, reported it as the boy who blinked again. But within academic circles, debate centered on whether grief and expectation could manipulate perception even in digital form. Psychologists weighed in, suggesting that human cognition cannot help but project motion onto stillness when emotion is involved. The same phenomenon that makes us see a breath in the chest of a loved one who's gone, or a flicker in an old film frame when we want to believe someone still exists there. The Boyle image, they argued, wasn't alive. We were. Still, the event forced curators to re-examine the photographer himself. In 2001, a new discovery emerged. Elias Kern's missing journal, recovered from a trunk donated to a Boston estate sale. The journal's final pages were water-damaged, ink fading to gray, but one line stood clear. He woke for a moment. "I wished I had not seen it." The entry was dated January 21, 1884, 11 days after Thomas Boyle's recorded death, the same interval between the two photographs. For historians, the words were both confirmation and condemnation. If taken literally, Kern had witnessed something beyond explanation, a final stir of life mistaken for death. But if metaphorical, it was equally haunting, the confession of a man consumed by guilt, documenting not resurrection but remorse. Debate ignited once again. Some claimed Kern had exploited the family's grief for profit, staging a second photograph to sell the illusion of peace. Others saw him as a broken witness, a craftsman who had captured the unbearable, then spent his life trying to prove to himself that it hadn't happened. In symposium papers and documentaries that followed, the Boyle case became a study in layered truth. The coroner's error, the mother's pleas, the second exposure, the missing journal, All could coexist without contradiction. No single fact needed to be supernatural. Reality itself was disturbing enough. Modern analysts concluded that the so-called blink effect was likely an optical illusion, a product of emulsion degradation and differential light scattering during the scan. Yet even after technical explanations settled, one question remained unanswered. Why did the image continue to evoke such unease, even among those who knew it was mechanical? Perhaps, as psychologists suggested, the photograph had transcended documentation. It had become a mirror of denial, a physical manifestation of the human refusal to let go. The illusion of motion wasn't proof of the boy's return. It was proof of how deeply people needed him to return. When Lydia Crane was later interviewed, she refused to describe what she saw. Her only statement was quiet, almost weary. Sometimes stillness lies to you, sometimes it doesn't. By 2005, the Boyle plate was sealed again, stored under controlled conditions and barred from further scanning. It remains unseen by the public. Its digital copy restricted to researchers under supervision, yet within those archives, it still carries the faintest shimmer of light in the pupil. The same point where every observer claims to feel watched, if only for a heartbeat. The narrator's tone lowers now. Reflective, nearly resigned, after a century and a half, the evidence no longer matters. What endures is the gaze, the illusion that refuses to fade. Whether it was a trick of exposure, a flicker of life, or the echo of a mother's faith, the Boyle photograph reminds us that death, too, can deceive. What blinked may not have been the boy, but the line between life and death itself. By the mid-1970s, the Boyle photograph had crossed from whispered legend into public curiosity. In 1976, the Massachusetts Historical Society briefly included it in an exhibition titled Faces of the Departed, The Lost Art of Post-Mortem Photography. The image hung in a dimly lit corner, framed in thick glass, no captions beyond its archival label. Thomas Boyle, Westbridge, 1884. The reaction was immediate and volatile. Visitors reported nausea, unease, even fainting. Local newspapers described crowds standing silently before the glass, transfixed, yet visibly disturbed. Within a week, the exhibit was closed, the photograph removed, and the museum issued a statement citing public distress disproportionate to artistic intent. That would be the only time the Boyle photograph was displayed publicly. In the years that followed, it migrated from gallery walls to academic journals. Scholars of grief, photography, and spiritualism began referencing it as a case study, not for what it proved, but for what it questioned. The image blurred boundaries between art and evidence, mourning and voyeurism, reverence and intrusion. By the late 1980s, it appeared in the Journal of Mortuary Culture under a new term coined by historian Dr. Alan Merrick, the Boyle paradox. The phrase described the tension between emotional truth and empirical impossibility, how something could feel undeniably real while defying every known explanation. Experts divided sharply. To some, the Boyle image was a visionary record, an early accidental study of human transition, that infinitesimal space between life and death. To others, it was a moral failure, an exploitation of a grieving family by a photographer too ambitious, or too obsessed, to draw ethical lines. Dr. Helen Stroud, who once examined the plate under magnification, summarized the divide in a 1994 symposium. Every era finds itself in that face, the child between two worlds. What we see there says less about him and more about ourselves. The cultural echoes have persisted into the digital age. Online forums debate the photograph's authenticity, frame by frame, pixel by pixel. Amateur analysts upload supposed reconstructions, each claiming to capture the elusive blink. None succeed. Artificial intelligence, machine learning, and modern restoration software have failed to reproduce the tonal anomaly. The phenomenon remains unreplicable, bound to its century-old medium, as if the image resists imitation. Today, the original glass negative lies sealed within a temperature-controlled vault at the Massachusetts State Archive, preserved under strict access policies. Only 3 people have handled it since 2005, each under watch and documentation. Even the high-resolution digital copy is encrypted and restricted, marked with the classification Sensitive Historical Material, Visual Distress Risk. The irony endures. A photograph once made to preserve memory is now hidden to protect those who might remember too vividly. What began as an act of devotion has become an artifact of restraint, an image both too powerful and too fragile for open display. The narrator's voice softens as the story draws toward reflection. In the end, Thomas Boyle was buried twice, once by his family and once by history. Photography once promised to hold memory still, to capture what time would eventually erase, but the Boyle photograph revealed something unsettling, that stillness can deceive, that a frozen moment may not bring peace, only doubt. It showed how the human desire to preserve what's gone can blur into something far darker, the refusal to accept loss itself. For centuries, we've turned to images to ease the ache of absence. Yet every photograph of the dead is also a confrontation, a mirror reflecting our own fear of forgetting. The Boyles believed they were saving their son's likeness. Instead, they created an image that refused to rest, an echo that kept whispering back through the decades. At what point does remembrance become trespass? When does the search for proof of love become an intrusion upon death's silence? The Boyle photograph leaves us without comfort, without closure, only the uneasy recognition that grief can make us reach beyond the natural order. Perhaps the truth of that photograph isn't about death at all, but about the living and what they cannot release. In 1884, Thomas Boyle may not have returned from the grave, but in that brief, impossible blink, it was the living who were seen.